Welcome back to our continuing coverage of the 2012 U.S. Chess League. We are in Week 2. This is Steve Farmer here, or as I'm known in Finland, Rebecca. We're going to present all 4 games in one video here, and I'm going to try and bring them as they were unfolding during the match so that you get a better feeling for what the players were looking at in front of them and what they were considering on their teammates' boards and the strategy that is sometimes used in team play versus what you would see in individual play. The first game we're going to look at here is Mackenzie Molnar at 25-11. He's playing the white pieces, and he's playing Sergey Ehrenberg from Philadelphia, and Sergey is rated 2700. Now this is an East meets West matchup. I think that they only do it once a year, maybe twice a year, that they have an East versus West matchup. Other than that, it's usually all within their own division, the Western Division or Eastern Division. Now, this is the first time these two teams have ever met. I don't know if Mac has ever played Sergey before, but for league play, this is the first time. All the pre-game bloggers were saying that Mackenzie was going to attack like a demon, like he always does, and that Sergey would just sit back and calmly defend and then pick up the point after Mackenzie falters along the way in his attack. Well, let's see if that comes true. The opening move was e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and one day I'll teach Mac the proper way to play the opening with d4, pawn takes, in c3, but let's get back to what Mac plays. Plays bishop to c4, bishop c5, and b4, the Evans Gambit. Mac is a true romantic, isn't he, Amanda? Bishop takes pawn, c3, and bishop to e7. Now, to help keep things clear, I'm going to change the board colors for each game, along with the photos, but, having a total board change will catch your eye much clearer, so you know that we are on a different game. However, doing the variations where I used to like to change colors, for these, since I'm going to be changing the boards a lot, I'm not going to change the colors in the variations. However, here I just want to point out, if you are going to play the Evans Gambit, you have to also be ready for bishop to a5, which is probably still the most common reply, or the more modern approach with bishop to d6. And this is gaining in popularity. In the game of Frisnet versus Nidich from Nancy, France, the play went somewhat like this. And it's pretty standard play for the Evans Gambit. But I want to make mention here, this is Frisnet versus Nidich, and they show White as being the winner at move 23, and when I went to that position, it was actually dead level. So I don't know why they gave White the point. It may have been a draw. So when you're looking at openings and you're using the reference database and you're saying, oh, I like this because White scores better in it. Well, if you're down to 4 or 5 games, you better look at all 4 or 5 games of those and see if that's really true. Because in this case, they show it as a win for White when it probably was a draw. If they ended at move 23, it was a dead level position. So just bear that in mind when you're preparing openings, that not everything is as it may seem. So in the game here, Sergey dropped the bishop back to e7, which is quite common actually. d4, knight a5, bishop to d3. Now, let's go back for a second here. Knight takes e5 is actually the more popular move, but I have more faith in the move that Mackenzie played here. And so in this position, after knight c4, d5, e d5, queen d5, knight e3, White's got his material back, but things are looking pretty level here. And Black's got the bishop pair, so he's got some trumps to this position as well. But back in our game, Mac decides to build up pressure and slowly play the position rather than going after the pawn right away. He plays bishop to d3. Now d6, and White can still win the pawn back, which he does. Knight f6, castles, castles, and here Mac plays queen to c2. Let's step back. In the 2011 U.S. Women's Championship, Tate Abrahamian played queen to e2 against Kamila Baginskite. And there Kamila played rook to e8. We'll come back to that in a moment. But bishop d6 looks like a logical move here. And now I think the best move here is to play knight f3. But in the game of Sipila versus Solozhenkin, Finland 2011, knight to c4 was played. And after the trades, knight to g4 was now played. But I think that Solozhenkin could have played queen to e7, and the idea is to bring the queen to e5. We're putting pressure on e4. Bring the queen to e5, threaten mate, and then bring the bishop to e6, being fully developed with a very good game for black, I would say. So, for example, if white protects the e-pawn, queen e5, g3, well, bishop to h3 now, hitting the rook to d1, bishop to c5 check, bishop e3, rook a d8. I think black's doing a bit better here. But here, instead of bishop to h3, black could also try bishop to e6 with a fine game as well, I believe. Okay, but in the game, Solozhenkin played knight to g4, and after h3, queen h4, knight to d2. You can't take the knight because of mate. So knight to d2, knight e5, bishop e3, bishop takes h3, and now pawn takes, queen takes, and queen to e3, knight f3 check, and we just got a perpetual, and a draw was agreed to here. Just want to give you a little bit of background on the Evans Gambit and why Mac played the way he did in the game. So in the Abrahamian Baggins game, after queen e2, rook to e8 was played, and then rook to d1, bishop to d6, knight f3, bishop g4, knight bd2, queen e7, rook e1, bishop e5, and now Tateyev played rook to b1. The thing here is you'll see this in our game that we're going to look at. The c3 pawn is hanging. What is the compensation for it? So let's take a quick look at that. Well, she didn't take right away, but she does in a bit, so we'll see it a moment here. So, okay, she does take on c3 here, and then queen e3, bishop b4. e5 was a mistake. Had she played a3 and bishop c5, I think that this is a little bit better for black. She played e5, bishop f3, gf3, and now Camilla misses the winning move here, I believe. I think she should have played knight to d5. She played bishop takes d2, but let's look at knight to d5. Alright, hits the queen, so we got to move it. Might as well threaten mate. g6, queen g4, knight to c6, f4, and now knight to d4. I would prefer to have black here. I just don't see how white's going to come up with any kind of real special attack out of this position. I think black is doing just fine. But in the game, instead of playing knight to d5, Camila played bishop takes d2, and after bishop takes d2 and knight to c4, the position is just wonderfully complex. This is a true Evans Gambit. Now, Tateyev playing white went on to win the game, but it's not a win at this point. It's rather unclear. Both sides got play. And this is the difficulty when you're facing the Evans Gambit, is there's often a lot of decisions to make, a lot of different paths you can go down. They're all very complex, so which one is the best? Not easy to come up with that. So, just giving you some flavor for why Mac played what he played in this game. So back to our game, Mac played queen to c2 instead of queen to e2, and Sergey played bishop to d6. And this is actually a new move in the position. Previously, c5 had been played, but Sergey's move makes some good sense. Now, Mac plays knight to f3, of course, getting the knight away from there, knight to c6, and now Mac plays bishop to g5. Now, if you have followed my videos in the past, especially the series I did on the Goring Gambit, you'll know that I've criticized the move bishop g5 in several cases, because that square is often left in reserve for the knight to hop up there at the right time. So I'm not sure if this move, bishop g5, is the best. Maybe knight b to d2, because that dark squared bishop can find employment elsewhere. It can find it on the c1h6 diagonal. It might come to b2 and shoot down the a1h8 diagonal. It might come to a3 at some time in the future and shoot down that diagonal as well. So I don't think white's too sure where he wants to place it at this point. But, you know, Mac surely has more experience with this opening and has studied it more than I have. So, you know, bishop g5 is okay. It's just that I think that it would be better to reserve it. And now h6, and Mac retreats the bishop. And now at this point, Mac has 54 minutes, and Sergey has 32 minutes, 47 seconds. So let's check in on board 2 and see how that one is faring. On board 2, we have the matchup of Bartel versus Mark Ginsburg. Bartel is rated 2489 and Mark is rated 2400, so Mark's a slight underdog. However, Mark played a very nice game in the first week against LA, so he's got high spirits and I look for him to do well in this game. Now, Bartel opens with D4, Knight F6, C4, E6, Knight C3, Bishop B4, E3, castles, Knight G to E2, D5, A3, Bishop to E7, C takes D5. Now, E takes D5 is the most popular here, but Mark plays Knight takes D5, G3, and now Mark plays C5. I actually like this way a little bit better than more typical Knight takes C3, Knight takes and C5. It's another way to handle this, but in practice, Black has had a difficult time facing the move D5. So this is probably why Mark has chosen this move order with C5 right away. Now D takes C5, Knight takes C3. Bartel decides to trade queens and test Mark in a queenless game. Queen takes D8, Rook takes D8, Knight takes C3, Bishop takes C5 getting the pawn back, and now Bishop to G2. Now a lot of people will look at this position and say, well, isn't White better here? He's got pressure on that B7 pawn. It looks rather difficult for Black. Well, the truth is that White's probably not going to trade for Black's Knight. That would just be a bad trade, positionally speaking. So Mark plays Knight to C6, and now Bishop D2 is played. Usually castles is seen there. And Bartel took about 9 minutes on that move, and Mark takes about 9 minutes to come up with Knight to E5. So at this point, White has 43 minutes 38 seconds, and Black is down to 32 minutes and 5 seconds. Okay, let's pop over to board 3 and see how Robbie is doing. Alright, here on board 3 we have Robbie Adamson playing Gorman. I think Gorman is from Israel. I'm not positive. But he's playing for Philadelphia. Robbie's rated 2415 and Gorman is 2327. So Robbie should be the favorite here. However, I have heard that Gorman is a pretty solid player himself. So we start out the game with E4 and E6. The French defense. The welfare state of the chess world. Too timid to push the pawn to the 4th rank, but not brazen enough to throw out a knight on move 1. D4, D5. Now, please don't take offense to that, French players. I have several friends that play the French defense. I have not been able to talk them out of it, regardless how many videos I made. Knight C3, Knight F6, Bishop G5, Bishop B4, E5, H6. Now, Bishop D2 is played in the game. H4 is playable, Bishop D2. Yeah, I do want to point out one thing that I was looking at. I was kind of curious about it. Bishop to E3. This is something White can consider here. If you're trying to get out a book, you might want to look at this, because the most typical line that Black's going to choose here is Knight to E4, Queen to G4 and G6, similar to what we see in the game. Knight Ge2, C5, and now I think that there are some games here, but White played something different. But I would recommend taking on C5. And this is the wrinkle I came up with this position. So if after Knight C6, because I am crazy and I look for any way I can to get an edge against Black in the French, castle queenside. Now Knight takes C3, Knight takes C3, Bishop takes C3, B takes C3, Queen to A5, and now King to D2. Bizarre little line, I know, but I think it's an interesting line and it's worth some testing. Who stands better? Well, it's a French defense. Nobody stands better, ever. But in the game, Robbie played Bishop to D2, and now we have Bishop takes C3, Pawn takes, Knight E4, Queen to G4, G6, Bishop to D3, Knight takes Bishop, King takes Knight, C5. Now, H4 is a good option here, but Robbie plays Knight F3, Knight C6. Again, I think H4 is the way to go. Plays Rook H to B1, and now Queen to E7, and now Robbie throws in H4. And this is actually a novelty here, at least according to my database, which has not been updated for a while. Queen f4 was played from the game of Shoot versus Madeira from Garapova, 1992. So if you want to play the French, you got to dust off some old games. And then there, g5, queen e3, g4, knight g1, cd4, cd4, queen h4. It's looking decent for black. I don't know. I think that maybe Robbie's move is better suited to the position. Though this game of Shoot versus Madeira was a draw in 95 moves. Oh, God, 95 moves of French defense. Oh, okay. So after queen e7, Robbie played h4. And now c4 is the natural move to block that bishop back onto a poor square. Bishop e2, rook to b8, a4, and b6. White has locked up the center and has pressure on both wings, but fortunately for black, his king does not have to leave home. As I mentioned, part of the welfare state of the chess world, the French defense. Queen f4, king to d7, knight to h2. Now, I think Robbie played this trying to tempt his opponent into making some sort of concession on the king side. And black does. He plays g5 here. Now Robbie plays queen to e3, and black plays f5. At least we got some action here. All right, we'll come back to this game in a moment, but we want to step in on board 4. We have Demelt for Philadelphia playing white. He's rated 2298, and he's paired against Pedram Atufi from Arizona. Pedram is rated 2275. Now, I actually had good hopes for Pedram in this game, although I have heard that Demelt is a pretty solid player as well. So, the game remains to be seen. e4 is played, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, ed4, knight takes d4, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop e7, castles, castles, c4, knight c6, knight takes knight, pawn takes, knight c3, knight to d7, bishop to e3, knight to e5, bishop e2, bishop e6, and b3. Now he blitzed these moves out pretty quick, but it's pretty well known theory. Pedram now plays bishop f6, which is a novelty according to my database. Previously seen has been f5 from the game Chernyshov versus Spensny from Česká Budějovice, 1998. Yeah, easy for me to say. In that game, f4 was played. Now knight f7, bishop f3. Now I think black should continue here with queen to d7. And after queen d2, knight to h6. And things are a little bit better for white here, but black's not in any hot water. In the game, though, Spensny played f takes e4, and after bishop takes e4, bishop to d7, queen d3, and h6. I think that white is clearly better here. Indeed, white went on to win in 27 moves, about 11 moves from here. But back in our game, Pedram just avoided all that and played bishop f6, aiming for a solid piece position rather than lashing out with f5. Demelt plays rook to c1, and now c5. And at this point, white has 45 minutes, 35 seconds. Black is at 44:18. Okay, we're getting through the opening phase here. Let's pop over to board 1. In this game, Sergei had hit the bishop with h6, and Mackenzie retreated it. And now Sergei plays g5. Scary looking move, but the most accurate, in my opinion. The dark squares are weak, but Sergei is sure he'll be able to keep control of the e5 square, and therefore f6 will be under control as well. So this is a weakness, but it is not a weakness if it cannot be exploited. However, if his dark square defense does not come through, it could spell catastrophe. But he's a 2700 player. He's not going to screw that up, I don't believe. So, of course here, Mac plays bishop to g3. And around this time, Sergei was chewing on the clock quite a bit. He plays knight h5. Let's go back. That's a good move. A rook to e8 is also a good move. The whole idea here is to bolster the e5 point so that white cannot throw the pawn up there to free up his pieces and gain more activity. It's one of the things you need to look at when you're playing an open game. What is that pawn move that my opponent's going to play that's just going to allow his pieces to flow into my camp? E5 would be the move here, but it's not possible, not yet at least. But after knight h5, the idea is to swap off that bishop on g3, which is supporting the possible push of e5. Now Mac plays knight b to d2, and Sergey plays bishop to g4. Taking a quick step back, if you had a wild hair up your nose, you could even play a move like g4 here. It's one of those moves that's so ugly only your mother could love it, but it is playable. It just shows you how wild some of these Evans gambits can get. Sergey played bishop g4, and now rook f to e1 was played. I was expecting rook a to b1, but he went rook f to e1. Knight takes bishop, h-pawn takes, now queen to f6, securing up the e5 square. At this point, Mackenzie has 47 minutes 38 seconds, and Sergey has dropped down to 23 minutes 28 seconds. Let's check in on board 2 and see how that's progressing so far. On board 2 we have Bartel versus Ginsburg, and Mark had just played knight to e5. Now, white is actually in a bit of difficulties here. Let's go back 2 moves. If you recall, I mentioned that castling here was more common, and white played the novelty of bishop to d2. I think we see now why castling was the move, because after knight to e5, all of a sudden white's in some difficulties here. He can't really castle. He's got to stay in touch with that bishop on d2. So he can't castle short, and he darn well can't castle long because of knight check, picking up the pawn on f2, forking the rooks, I might add. So he has to keep his king in the center, and he plays king to e2. Just because the king is stuck in the center doesn't mean that black's got to win game. But Mark is a sharp guy, and when he gets a positional advantage, he tries to find the best way to hold on to it. And he plays knight to c4 here. Bartel now plays a passive move. He plays bishop to c1. And this just seems timid to me. I understand that in team situations you want to play things close to the vest, but this is maybe being a little too cautious. Let's go back. I think that knight to e4 was a better idea. And after bishop f8, bishop c3, and I think position is just dead level here. Going back to our game though, Bartel played bishop to c1, and now rook to b8, b3, knight to e5, and now knight to e4. Now, before I mentioned this was a good move. Here, it may well be the losing mistake. White is down to 24 minutes 33 seconds, and black is actually up on the clock. He has 26 minutes 40 seconds. So let's pop in on Robbie's game and see how that's going. Okay, we're back on board 3 where Robbie Adamson has white pieces against Gorman, and Gorman plays f5. Now, I think that what Robbie was trying to tempt him with was to get him to play g takes h4. And I think after knight to g4, queen to g5, f4, queen to g6, queen to h3, knight to e7, knight f6 is check, king c7, queen takes h4, getting the pawn back, knight to f5, getting the typical French post for the knight, queen f2, knight g3, a5, b5, and bishop f3. I think we just have a level game here where both players stand poorly. In the game, though, Gorman played f5, and now Robbie took en passant. Queen takes f6, hg5. I was expecting rook to h1. And here's why I was expecting that. Because if g takes h4, then knight to f3, looking to win the pawn back. The idea is also to transfer the rooks over to the king side for play over there where things are starting to open up a bit. So, for example, if king to d6, then rook takes h4, rook to b7, getting ready to swing over, rook a h1, rook b h7, and g3. I think white is slightly better here. Winnable, I don't know, but these are the kind of positions that when you're the white player against the French, you play on for a long time and you just torture your opponent. Now, white does not have an attractive bishop, not by any stretch of the imagination, but technically the bishop is not bad. Black, on the other hand, he has a bad bishop, so one reason to play on is for that, though the edge is probably minimal. But Robbie didn't play that. He played pawn takes on g5. And now, queen takes g5. White is down to 25 minutes and 36 seconds, and black is at 29 minutes 30 seconds. So let's pop over to board 4 and see what's happening there. Pedram had just played c5. Demelt plays f4. knight c6 and e5. Very aggressive style, and it is the correct line to play. Pawn takes on e5, and now a sharp move by Demelt. He plays f5. It doesn't make any sense to just trade on e5. So this move cramps black's position quite a bit. Bishop d7, now bishop takes c5, getting the pawn back in this manner. Rook to e8. Now Pedram's been handling his time well up to this point. Seems white is clearly better in this position, but still, it's early in the game, and anything can happen. The time has gotten to 32 minutes and 40 seconds for white, so he's used up almost 15 minutes over these few moves. And black is at 37-34, used up about 7 minutes. Let's get over to Mac's game and see what's happening there. Ehrenberg has just played queen to f6, and he's playing Mackenzie Molnar. Now, Mac takes about 11 minutes and comes up with the move rook a to b1. Now, Sergey takes some time and comes up with rook a to b8. Now, white is down to 35 minutes, 55 seconds. Black has dropped all the way down to 17 minutes, 17 seconds. Now, since the players took a good deal of time on these moves, we're going to move on to board 2 to see if anything's advanced further on that one. Okay, we rejoin this game where white has just played knight to e4 in Bartel versus Ginsburg. And I mentioned this was a mistake, but Mark must find the correct path to exploit it. And the path that you need to take seems kind of anti-positional. So I'm very impressed that Mark found this move. And he plays b6. Very good. The idea is to obviously play bishop a6 and keep the white king stuck in the center. But to play this move, you have to come up with some concrete analysis. So, what happens if he plays, knight to d2? What happens if he plays knight takes bishop? Well, let's look at knight takes bishop first. The idea here is after b takes, we're hitting the pawn on b3 right away. It's built-in pressure. And things are not so easy for white. Bishop e4 is probably the best move. What if he tries to defend that pawn? Well, now we get in our planned bishop to a6, king to e1. Where else can he go? Knight checks. Now, if king to e2, this is double check, so he just drops a piece. So king to d2, knight takes f2, or if he went to king to d1, same thing. This is discovered check, king moves, and then we pick up the exchange and a pawn out of the deal. So that doesn't work. Rook to b1 fails. So bishop e4 is just willing to give up that b pawn in order to get some play. Bishop a6 check, king drops back, and now rook takes b3. And black is up a clear pawn with a good position. White's rooks are disconnected. It's not looking good for white at all here. I'd have to say that black is winning. Right, so that was knight takes c5. What about knight to d2? Well, then bishop checks. And now knight to c4 is pretty much forced. If he tries king to d1, we go knight to d3, threatening the fork, rook to f1, rook b to c8, just positional buildup, b4, bishop e7, we're going to reroute that bishop, rook to b1, otherwise bishop f6 comes in with tempo, rook to c3. White is just about in Zugzwang, believe it or not. f4, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, rook takes a3, winning a pawn. Yeah, so after bishop to a6 check, knight to c4 is pretty much forced instead of king to d1. And now we have rook to d3. This is a really neat move. It looks like, hey, can't I just take that knight and undermine everything? Well, you have a discovered check with rook takes e3. Now king to d1, we centralize the other rook. King to c2, rook takes knight on e5, and just to carry it out a few more moves, black is 2 pawns up, winning easily. So that's why rook to d3 is such a cool move. Alright, so he can't take knight, but what if he tries like f4? Well, we can take the pawn on b3, fe5, bishop takes c4, and this looks to be winning for black as well. So knight to d2 doesn't work. In the game, Bartel played bishop to d2. And now Mark didn't waste any time in playing bishop to a6 check. I thought that Mark had it in the bag at this point. I mean, just look at his position. White is soon to be so uncoordinated that he's not going to be able to put up much of a resistance, whereas black just has a move or two before he's just completely locked up on the position. So Bartel plays king to d1. Now bishop to e7. Now I thought h3 was a good move here. It was not played, but let's look at it. The idea is to keep the knight out of g4. Rook b c8, rook c1, trade the rooks. Bishop takes a3, picking up a pawn, king to b1, f5, bishop to c3, and knight to d3. Now, white's in a world of hurts here, but this might have been the best way to go. In the game, though, he played f4. And now I think Mark made things a little more difficult on himself than he needed to. He plays knight to g4. Let's go back for a moment. Actually, let's move on to the next game, and I'll let you think about this for a moment. You can pause the video here, and we'll come back to this. What do you think Black should have played here? Alright, but for right now, we'll move on to the next game. Okay, we're back to board 3, where queen takes g5 was just played by Garmin, and Robbie is down on the clock. And just like a bear in a Studebaker, Robbie is in his element, being down on time. Robbie plays knight to g4, and this allows a queen trade, and king to e7, rook to h1, h5, knight to e5, knight takes, pawn takes, h4, g3. Now, Robbie starts to play things close to the vest because boards 2 and 4 were looking pretty good at this point for the Scorpions. Going back though, had Robbie needed to play for more, he might have tried rook to h2. And the idea here is after bishop to b7 to play bishop to g4. This improves the bishop and it blocks up the g-file. So for example, play could continue with rook to h6, f3, rook f8, a5, b5, b takes a5, rook takes a5, a6, and again we have one of those positions in the French, whereas white, I would continue playing until my social security checks started to arrive, or until the time ran out on the clock. This is a good position for white. Winning, I'd have to say no, it's not winning. But in a practical chances sort of situation, you'd have to like white's chances to win. He at least seems to have the luxury of playing for 2 results. Going back though, in our game, Robbie played g3 instead, which allows h3, rook h2, bishop to d7, and bishop to g4. Now, this is a logical move, but I think Robbie misses a chance to get the better of things. I think he could have tried a5 here. And if ba5, rook a5, now black is at a crossroads. If he defends with rook to a8, we can play f4, rook ag8, king f3, rook a8, bishop to f1, and we're going to round up that pawn, and white seems to have some decent winning chances here. And after rook takes a5, instead of rook to a8, if black gets active with his rook and goes rook to b1, rook takes a7, rook to c1, king to d2, rook to g1. You know, he wants to come to g2 and then advance the pawn and play rook to g1, but we just don't let that happen. Bishop to f3, rook to h7, and I think the black is surviving in this line, but it doesn't look real attractive. I mean, compare the bishops. The activity of the black rooks helps him a bit, but not by much. I think white is clearly better here, but the win, I would not say, is there. I think that he has good chances, but it's not concrete that he'll win. However, after bishop to g4 in the game, this is going to win back the pawn, but not much more than that. Now a5 by black just stops all that garbage that white could have gotten into by playing a5 himself. Now at this point, Robbie is down on the clock again. He has 16 minutes 43 seconds. Black has 16 minutes 44 seconds. He's a full 1 second above Robbie on the clock. Alright, let's pop over to the board 4 and see what's happening in Pedram's game. Alright, we're back on board 4 where Pedram just played rook to e8 and Demelt from Philadelphia plays queen to d5. Now knight to e7, and here I thought Demelt should just drop his queen back to e4 with a slightly favorable position, but he plays bishop takes e7. And now queen takes e7. Now the players have been using their time on this one. White is down to 19 minutes 30 seconds, and if you'll remember, he started out with 32:40 before this segment. So just a couple moves, he's used well over 10 minutes. Pedram is at 34:03, so he has used 3 minutes and 30 seconds for the last couple moves. All right, let's get back to board 1 and see how Mac is faring there. We rejoin board 1 where Sergey has played rook a to b8 and Mac now plays knight to c4. The position is actually pretty level here. And after bishop takes f3, I was expecting Mac to play knight takes d6. He did not. He played g takes f3. Let's pop back and look at knight takes d6. Well, I think c takes d6 is actually the best way to go for black here. And after pawn takes bishop, queen takes, and then rook e d1. Yeah, the position still looks pretty level. And we'll see something similar to this in the game. So Mac took right away on f3. Now, I mentioned earlier on in the video that Sergey is not afraid of fireworks. On the contrary, he's rather expecting fireworks in the game with Mackenzie Molnar. So here we see Sergey play b5. And it's Sergey that's lighting the Roman candle himself. Yeah, Sergey used about 10 minutes on this move, so this drops our times down to 22 minutes 55 seconds for white, and Sergey's all the way down to 4 minutes 28 seconds. All right, I'm going to leave you with this cliffhanger here, and we'll join in on board 2. Mark Ginsburg has the black pieces against Bartel from Philly. And Mark here played knight to g4, and I asked you to think about this position, what you would play. So, did you pause the video? If you haven't, go ahead and do so, and see if you can find the best move for black here. Okay, well, I think the move is knight to d3, and I think after this, white is lost. For example, we're threatening to play f5, we're threatening bishop to b7, all to undermine the knight on e4, and then fork on f2. So, what kind of choices are there? First of all, if rook to g1, just to avoid any possibility of that fork, and rook b to c8, rook to a2, trying to get a second line defense there. f5, knight to g5, bishop to f6, bishop to f1, knight to b2 is check. And now the point here is, if king to e1, then rook to c2, knight f3 defends the bishop, but bishop to b7, we're threatening to remove the defender. Knight to d4, hitting the rook, but now rook takes d4, e d4, and bishop takes d4. And look at this. Now, this is very easy to escape the mental picture that you have of a position, but this is just crushing. There's a few threats here. There's a threat to win the rook on g1. It has nowhere to go. There's also a threat to play knight to d3 and rook takes a2. There's nothing to avoid that. Black is just winning here. Not easy to see, though, from this position here. So if he plays rook takes b2 instead of king to e1, then bishop takes, and we've got the exchange, and bishop takes a6, rook to c1, check, and then we take the rook here. Like I said, we have the exchange here. And very nice open position, open files for the rooks to play on. Yeah, black has got to be winning this. So going back to where black could have played knight to d3, instead of rook to g1, another try here is bishop to f1, just trying to get rid of that octopus knight there on d3. And then bishop to b7, look at that pin on the long diagonal there. Bishop takes on d3, rook takes. Now, how do you defend the knight and the rook? Well, there is a move. Coming here and attacking the rook on d3. Rook takes b3, just flat out wins a pawn. King to c2. Now bishop to d5, improve the pieces. Rook h c1, bishop f6, rook a b1. Now if he goes rook to a2, then he's just going to lose that rook. So these bishops are sweeping across the board in all sorts of different directions. So rook a b1, and now rook takes a3, picking up a second pawn. And the bishops are all powerful in this position. White is lost. So yeah, it's not easy to see all those lines from this position here. But Mark had a plan of knight to g4, hoping to come around to h6 to f5 to add pressure. But yeah, I think he missed a good chance there with knight to d3. In the game, he played knight to g4, Now king to e1, stepping out of the pin. And now Mark plays bishop to b7. Now black is clearly better here, and I'm not sure that he's winning anymore. But we come to another cute little line here that I'm proud that I saw this, and I saw it rather quickly because Mark didn't have a lot of time to think over his move here. But I made a comment that rook takes d2 looks like it's a good winning try. And then Mark played his move, so this kind of got lost in the chat room a little bit. But then Ben Marmot piped up and says, hey, yeah, maybe rook takes d2 did work. So let's look at it a little further. What's the point of this? If he grabs with the king, we're just going to be bringing our rook into the game and continue on. So it looks like knight takes is the most logical try. And then knight takes here. Okay, we're threatening to take the bishop, and we're threatening to go to c2 with a fork. So there's only one move to stop this. So, we're looking at lines that are checks, captures, and forced moves. And this eases your process, because if they're forced moves, they're rather easy to predict. And so that's why that saying comes up. Look at checks, captures, and forced moves. So bishop e4 stops both those threats, saves the bishop, guards the c2 square. But now we go f5. This may be what Mark didn't see, is where does the bishop go? It's only got one square. So we have a problem here that white is suffering from lack of coordination of his rooks. His king is in the way. But after f5, he also has to throw the bishop in the way as well. All right, rook to c8 now. Threatens to win the rook on h8. And he's in for a bit of surprise, because if he plays king to f2, then we go knight to g5 check, and if he drops the king back to the first rank, we're still going to get in rook to c8, and then we have the possibility of taking the rook free and clear, or if the king comes over to g2 to guard it, we have bishop to b7 as an in-between check, and then we pick up the rook for free. So his only move here is to play knight to c4. So he has to give some material back. So now knight takes c4, pawn takes, and bishop takes c4. More threats. We're threatening to win the exchange of that rook on a1. And to be quite honest, I don't see how he can get out of this one. I think the best here is to try king to d2. Bishop f6 hits the rook. Now go up here and fess up that you're losing the exchange. King to f7, rook c1, take, and bishop to d4. After all is said and done, black is up 2 pawns. Now it is bishops of opposite colors, so that scares a lot of people away, because it seems to be very drawish. But in this situation, I don't believe it is a draw. I think that black has a win here. Now, somebody stronger and smarter than me can prove me wrong, I'm sure. I think black is winning. So yeah, I was rather proud of seeing the move rook takes d2, and that I saw it rather quickly. But Mark didn't have a chance to see that. He's worried. He's sitting there. He has the pressure on. He's sitting down, cutting off the blood flow to the brain, and he has to come up with a move. Bishop b7 is a decent move, but I think rook takes d2 wins the game. Alright, so now h3, and now knight to h6. Now, I understand Mark's concept of this, but I thought that knight to f6 might have been a little better. Let's take a look at that. Now, as the game was unfolding, Ben Marmont mentioned that knight to f6 looked like that won material. So let's take a look at this. It does win material. Knight takes f6 is check, so bishop takes, and now he's got a couple choices. If he goes rook to c1, and bishop takes g2, hits the rook, rook to h2, and bishop to b7. And yeah, isn't black just up a piece? Yeah, he is. So bishop takes b7 has to be tried. Bishop takes a1, bishop a6, bishop b2, a4, rook to d7, king to e2, and rook b to d8. Now black is up the exchange, and there's plenty of open files for the rooks. White does have a bishop pair, so that complicates the win somewhat, but I think it's still a win for black. If we go back to the game continuation where Mark played knight to h6, I can understand his concept. Rook to g1 was played. Now, black is better here, but not as well as in the lines we just looked at. Knight f5, knight f2, bishop takes g2. Let's go back for a moment. Bishop to a6 allows bishop to e4, rook b to c8, and b4. I think black is better here. So I think that it's wiser for him to trade on g2 as Mark did in the game. Rook takes and rook b to c8, rook a2. Now, running low on time, both players play below their ability. White should here play e5. And after f takes, rook to c5, and I think black is clearly better. But Mark plays h5. And now a sharp move by Bartel. He plays g4. Now the trade of pawns, and knight to d6. And it seems like white is scratching his way back into the game. I think, as a matter of fact, if he plays rook to h2, it's getting darn close to being level again. Now, his rooks are still not talking to each other. Before, they were on the first rank, interrupted by a piece or two. Now they're on the second rank, interrupted by a piece or two. He plays bishop b4, bishop to h4. Now bishop takes d6, rook takes d6. And now if Bartel was to play king to e2, black is just a bit better, no more. But he plays rook to d2, and this is a horrible, horrible mistake. Can you see why? Pause the video, find the winning continuation for this endgame. Okay, the move is rook to c1 check. Now king to e2, rook takes rook check, king takes, and now rook to a1. And the threat is twofold. We're threatening rook to a2 check and winning the knight, or forcing the white king to go back to e1 to defend it, in which case we can pick off the pawn. So now white plays king to e2, but if he tried a4, that doesn't change things that much because we go check, as I mentioned, king to e1, and now rook to b2 is going to round up the b pawn. Black is going to be a healthy pawn ahead. He's going to have a bishop versus knight in an endgame with pawns on two sides of the board, king side and queen side. This is pretty much a theoretical win for black. In the game, though, he played king to e2, and after bishop takes f2, rook takes f2, rook takes a3, he decided to go ahead and pack it in at this point. So get on with our next game here. We're back on board 3. Robbie Adamson has white, and he's playing Garmin. And Garmin played a5. Keep Robbie from playing that. If you'll recall, I mentioned Robbie should have played that rather than bishop at g4. Now, this bolsters things on the queen side, but really gives black no chance to win. Rook h3, rook h3, bishop h3, rook h8, bishop g4, king to d8, bishop to e2, bishop to e8, bishop g4, bishop d7. Well, I think we see where this one's going. Instead of rooks moving around, we have bishops moving around. Bishop g4 and bishop d7, and the players agreed to a draw. And with a draw in this game and a win in the Ginsburg game, Arizona is up 1.5 to 1/2. Looking good for Arizona so far. Let's get on with the game on board 4. Pedram played queen takes e7 here, so the trades have been made, and now knight to e4. White's position looks pretty good here. Pedram plays rook a d8, and now I think white could play knight takes f6 here and have a level game. He plays queen to b7. Let's take a look at knight f6. Queen takes, queen to b7, and then queen h6. And yeah, it looks pretty level. The threat is to come into e3, and that's check, and then you can possibly drop the queen back to b6 and guard both pawns. So it looks pretty level here. But in the game, Demo didn't play that. He played queen to b7. I think this is most accurate. And now bishop to g5. Again, the most accurate. Rook to c3. Now Pedram plays bishop to f4. And I thought this move was okay until I noticed, real briefly, the possibility white could play f6. And then that started to worry me a bit. We'll come to that in a moment. I think that in light of f6 being a strong move for white, I think that black should try bishop to c8. Couple choices here for white. Queen takes a7, bishop f4 now, and if g3, then bishop takes f5, and I think black is going to get the better of things here. So f6 is still a concern, but g takes f6, g3, f5 now, and now g takes f3, and the idea is if we take on e4, then he can come here with check, and this looks a little precarious, but if we do it slightly differently and play e takes f4, now notice the battery of the queen and the rook on the bishop and knight there, they're skewered, so one of those pieces is going to drop. But he can play rook takes f4, fe4, and now rook g3 here, king h8, queen to e3, f5. And this is the difference between the two positions. I think that though black's king is a bit opened up, he has managed to close things up with light square blockade, and if queen c3, the dark squares are covered too after queen e5. And black might be even a little better here. So after bishop c8, instead of queen takes a7, you can try queen to c6, and then we get a similar line with bishop f4, f6, queen d7, queen takes, rook takes, pawn takes, king takes, and I think this position is just about dead level. So, going back to the game continuation where bishop to f4 was played, white now played queen takes c7, gets greedy, going after a pawn. I love greedy people, thank you. But what had me worried was f6, which was not played in the game. Now what do you do? I think queen to e6 is the best. Now queen takes c7, queen to c6, trade queens. Now bishop f3. I think white is solid as a rock, and he's got a positional edge as well. Not huge, but enough to last for a long time. So I was worried about that f6 line here. Instead, he played queen takes, and now Pedram plays bishop takes f5. We'll come back to this in a moment. At this point, white is down to 4 minutes, 44 seconds. Black has 23 minutes, 30 seconds. So it's looking rather favorable for black on this board. He's got more time, and I believe the position here is equal. Might be a bit better for black. We'll come back to this. Let's check in on Kenzie Molnar versus Sergey Ehrenberg. Coming back to board 1, we see the position where Sergey had just played b5, hitting a knight on c4. Now, Mackenzie plays knight takes d6, and they started to slow down, settle down their play somewhat, because they were getting ahead of the other boards by a few moves, and you want to see what's happening on the other boards so you can determine what you have to play for on this board. And everything on all the other boards at this time was rather close. Maybe Mark Ginsburg had the upper hand in his game. It wasn't a win yet, but it was still close enough that you wanted to eye it for a little bit and see how it was turning out. And if it turned out that Mark is winning, then Max should be happy with a draw here. And that's because Ravi's game and Pedram's games both looked like they could hold to draws. Actually, Pedram was in a little bit of a bind, but it still looked like he should be able to hold it. Okay. Now, black is under 5 minutes here, and he plays c takes d6. And now Mac grabs a pawn with bishop takes b5. Now, it's rather strange how the Evans Gambit has evolved over the years. 100 years ago, it was famous for many great attacking games. Well, we have much better defense in modern times, and that's no longer the case. The attacking games, though you see them once in a while, it's usually due to some serious error by the opponent. In today's games, the defense is so well thought out and well planned in advance that you're not going to get those kind of attacks. So the Evans Gambit, a true romantics game, has been converted into modern chess as a positional tool, not a tactical tool. Tactics are used to create positional advantages. They're not used for attacking and mating the opponent anymore. They're used for positional gains. So after grabbing the pawn, Sergey plays knight to e5, bishop to e2. Now black can grab a pawn, and he does. Queen takes f3, rook to e3, queen to f6. So things are pretty level here. The material's equal. Both sides have weaknesses to deal with, weak pawns. For white, it's the c3 and a2 pawns. For black, it's the d6 and a7 pawns. Black's weakness on the king side pawn structure is really not of any importance at this point of the game. We have only heavy pieces on, so there's no chance of white coming in on any sort of color complex into the black camp. So the weaknesses of the advanced pawns on the king side for black are not germane to what's going to unfold here. Okay, we'll continue on with this game a bit more as the play is very simple. The players look to exploit the weaknesses of the opponent and defend their own weaknesses. It's very simple to understand what happens from here on out. Mac plays king to g2, rook fc8, rook to b3, queen to e7, queen to d2, queen to e6, queen to b2, rook takes b3, and now Mac tries to keep the door open and keep all the options on the table that he can. He plays queen takes b3. Now I think Mac would prefer to trade the queens and would prefer to be the one to get the draw here, because things at this point were looking pretty good on board too. It looked like Mark had his opponent on the run. It's kind of funny because while I was watching the games, Amanda Mateer piped up and made the comment that Mac hates rook and pawn endgames. And she later amended this to say that Mac doesn't like any games that go past move 40. And so we know Mac is a romantic at chess. Sergey does not trade because that would straighten out White's pawn structure, and he doesn't want to do that, but he does play queen to c4. Well, Amanda, I hope that Mac does learn to love rook and pawn endgames, because guess where we're heading? Queen takes c4, rook takes rook to d3, rook to c6. The rest of the moves in this game are pretty much what I would basically call filler. Just waiting things out to see how they're doing on the other boards. You know, actually it was probably not Sergey's choice to do it this way. Mac, I think, would have been happy right here and now with a draw and would have walked away with it. King f3, king g7, king e3, king f6, king to d4, nice king position in the center there, king to e6, making sure White can't go anywhere with it. f4, rook a6, hitting a2, rook to d2, defending a2, rook a4 check, c4. This pretty much means that forever that pawn is going to be stuck on d6. Rook to a3, rook to h2. Nice little opportunity to trade some material here. Now, rook takes g3 and rook takes h6 would simply transpose. Sergey played king to e7. Rook takes on h6, rook takes on g3, f takes g5, rook takes g5, rook h3. Now, both sides could lose this game if they slipped up, but it's pretty easy to understand what moves have to be played here. Sergey played rook to a5, a3, bringing the pawn up to where it's protected by the rook. King to e6, rook to b3, rook to a6, rook to f3. Just biding time, folks. That's all that's going on here. Rook to b6, rook to f5, rook to a6, rook to f3, rook a5, rook b3, king d7, rook to b7 check, king to e6, rook to b3, king to d7. Mac checks again, hoping it'll just go back to e6 and take a draw, but Sergey could not afford that at this point. Board 4 was now looking rather questionable, so he had to play on. King to c6, rook takes f7, rook takes a3. But try as he might, this does not lead to any sort of an advantage for black, nor does it lead to an advantage for white. Rook f6, rook a5, rook f7, rook to a1, rook f6, rook d1 check, king c3, rook c1 check, king to d4, rook to e1, rook to f5, rook to a1, rook to f6, rook checks again, king to c3, rook to e1, king to d4, a5, rook to f5, hitting a pawn. He goes to defend it. And we'll come back to this game in a moment. Let's check in on the other board and see what's happening there. Coming back to our game of Pedram Atufi playing black against Demelt. Pedram played bishop takes f5. Let's step back for a moment. Now, team play is going on here. Bishop takes f5 looks like a good chance to keep things alive. But Pedram was trying to probably evaluate what happens after bishop takes h2 here, because he thought for a long time on this move. A very long time. Here's the thing. Let's look at bishop takes h2. And if he takes, then this actually will lead to a draw. A forced draw. Okay. Rook to d3. Bishop c6. Threatening mate. Rook f2. Rook takes d3. Bishop takes. And now we can play queen takes d3. Queen takes c6. And you see it here, don't you? Check. 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 and it's not going to stop. Now the thing to remember here is that Mark, by winning his game, or at least by this point he's looking like it was in the bag, and with board 3 being a draw on this board would be fine because Mac and Sergey were in a very equal rook and pawn ending, and it didn't look like either side had any winning chances. So a draw would have been fine here. But I don't think that Mark's game was completely over at this point. And that being the case, and we saw how Mark's game looked like he was winning and then crushing, and then all of a sudden it was slipping away a bit, and he missed the sack on d2. You know, a lot of things were going on there, so it was kind of up in the air. So poor Pedram had to really think about this. I mean, wouldn't you love to play bishop takes h2 here and force a draw and just get it done with? If you knew you had one game in the bag and everything else was going to be a draw, that would give you the match. Yes, you would take it. So I have to tip my hat to Pedram for playing bishop takes f5. Okay, play continued with queen takes e7, rook takes e7, and now I think if white plays bishop f3, he's just got a level game, but he plays knight to g3, which I think is an inferior move. Bishop to g6, okay, the plan is to push the pawn. Now rook to d1 was played. Now I think, to be fair to white, he had a little bit better shot with playing c5 here. You know, you got past pawns, you want to push them. But let's get on with the game. Rook to d1 was played. Rook takes d1, bishop takes d1, bishop to d2, rook to f3, and now e4. Now this is in keeping with the theme, the idea of play that has led up to this position. But still, let's take a step back. I think that it was a little too early to push this pawn. I think rook to d7 was slightly more accurate here. Okay, we're threatening to bring that bishop back to block the pawns and attack the bishop on d1. So for example, if a3, bishop c1, we hit the bishop and we're hitting the pawn on a3. Yay, winning for black. So bishop to e2, and now we can play bishop to b4, and we're just blocking up the queenside pawns with our dark squared bishop. Black is clearly better. Now he has not advanced that e-pawn too far, at least not at this point, so he can now start bringing his king into position and then think about advancing the pawn. Back in the game, however, he played e4, and now rook f1, and I think that black's edge is just minimal at this point. Bishop e3 check, king tucks away, bishop c5, bishop g4, and now I think Pedram starts to lose the thread of the game a bit. He plays e3, and this is just pushing the pawn too far up the board. Let's take a step back. At least that's my opinion. You can swear at me if you like, Pedram. I'm just trying to point out what my beliefs are. So I think rook to e5. It's a logical idea here. You're going to want to try and bring the king in. You're going to want to try and bolster that pawn with f7, f5 at some point. So for example, if bishop to d1, king f8, bishop to c2, king e7, knight to e2, or rook to e1, doesn't matter. Now we have f5. Black is very solid. Material's equal, but I would have to give black the edge here due to the bishop pair and this rather strange blockade on the queen side. In the game, though, Pedram played e3, and this is, you know, we've heard the saying before, you got to pass pawn, push it. All right, rook to d1 was played, now h5. King to f8 seemed better to me. Let's take a look at why. King f8, rook to d5, rook to c7, knight f5, f6, bishop e2, bishop takes f5, rook takes, and king e7. Now this is looking pretty level here, but black's got a more active king position. His rook is not active, but his bishop's doing a good job blockading the queen side, defending the king pawn, and black will be able to play rook to d7 and maybe infiltrate along that line. I would prefer to have black here, though honestly this is pretty level. In the game, Pedram played h5. It's a cute little trappy move, but white sidesteps the temptation. He plays bishop f3. What happens if he takes the pawn? It looks like he's just giving up a pawn, right? Well, here you have bishop takes h5, rook to d8, check, Well, let's step back. He played knight takes h5 too, couldn't he? Oh, you got e2, rook to e1, bishop to b4, and guess what? He has to give up the rook. I think black might be able to win this. So after bishop takes h5, he can check with the rook. And after king h7, rook to d5, he's forking those bishops, isn't he? Bishop to g6. Because if he takes, then we go here. Knight takes e2, rook takes, and we're threatening mate. No time for white to go after the a-pawn. He has to give his king luft. And now rook takes a2. After a5, I think black is just flat out winning this. So, yeah, h5 was a trappy move. I think king to f8 was a solid choice, but h5 was a nice little trappy move. But his opponent didn't fall for it, and I heard that Demelt was a pretty solid player. Played bishop f3, h4, knight to e2, now bishop to b4. I think rook to e5 was a little better, but okay, bishop to b4. Rook to d5, bishop to b1, rook to b5, and now he plays bishop to d2. I thought the bishop to d6, keeping the bishop in front of the pawns, might have been a more solid way to go at this. He played bishop to d2. I don't think it's that big of a difference, but personal preference again. a3, bishop to d3, rook to d5, bishop to c2, b4, and now f5. And I hate to say it, but I think Pedram really lost the thread at this point. At least in my book. I was counting him out. I was already chalking the victory up to white. Now, as a die-hard Scorpion fan, it's very hard to make that kind of assessment, to think that, hey, this guy's going to lose and we're going to draw this match. But you know what? A drawn match against Philadelphia is not the worst thing in the world. So, instead of f5, I think he could have tried g6. Okay, well, he can play rook to d4 here, hidden that pawn, and we have to play g5 here. Rook to d5, and now f6. And you know what, folks? I don't think that white's winning this game. He has maybe a tiny bit better position, but how do you win it? Black's got the bishop pair. He's got well-coordinated pawns. His rook is doing a good job on the second rank and on the e-file. His king's going to be able to come in. White has none of those luxuries. His rook's more active than black's, but that's about it. His knight and his bishop are used to block the e-pawn. That's a sad task for the two pieces. So if you ask yourself, is white winning this? How does he make progress? So I give it to you, and if you know, I'm sure there's players out there that are going to say, yeah, white's winning this. He may be. But the point is this is a lot better than the continuous downfall that Pedram went through in this endgame. In the game, he played f5. Now c5. You got to pass pawn push it. But I think that white's only still just a bit better here. And now Pedram plays g5. Curiouser and curiouser. Further down the rabbit hole we go. Here, it may be too late for black, but he can try g6. Rook to d6, king to g7, knight f4, e2, knight takes, bishop to f4. Now I can't take because of mate. So rook to d8, bishop to c1, rook to d4, and bishop to a4. This still looks good for white, but it's putting up some resistance and gaining some activity for black. He's given up the pawn, but he has a lot more activity for it. Given the choices here, I'd rather have white, of course. But, you know, after g5, against best play, he should be lost. White plays h3, and I don't think that's correct. I think he should play c6, and I think that black is busted after this. For example, after bishop a4, rook to a5. We're hitting the pawn on a7, we're hitting the bishop on a4, and we're hitting the pawn on f5. So how to get out of this? Bishop to d1. And here, rook takes f5, and this is looking winning for white. In the game, though, he played h3. And now g4. This way, shouts the Mad Hatter. Now I think that king to f7 might still have some chances to save the game, because c6 now, we have rook to c7, and knight to d4. Yeah, white is better, no doubt, but there's some chances to hold the game here. Back in the game, g4 was played, pawn takes, now rook to g5 check. Actually, bishop takes g4 is a little more straightforward. Now, rook to g7 should be tried. You played king to f8. Now, rook takes g4. Rook to h7. I think that black is objectively losing at this point. King h2, king to e7, bishop to e4, bishop takes e4, rook takes e4 with check, king to d7, and now I think b5 is the strongest move for white. He plays king to h3, rook to f7. Now, I don't know many people to be willing to trade rooks down a pawn in an endgame like this, but it's possible that king to c6 was a little better, because after rook takes, king takes a5, ba5, bishop takes a5. Black may be able to draw this game. White certainly got the ability to play for two results here, but black has some chances to hold this. But in a game, he played rook to f7, and now rook to f4. This is a crazy game. Who knows what's going to happen in this league. b5 looked like it was winning pretty quickly. King c7 and knight to d4. I think this is just really pushing things to the max for white. Instead, he played rook to f4, and now rook takes f4. And suddenly, it looks like he might be able to save the game. With Mark winning his game, Robbie drawing his, and the Ehrenberg-Molnar game in a book draw, rook and pawn ending, a draw here would save the match for Arizona. Arizona would take the match. Knight takes f4, bishop c1, a4, bishop to a3, knight to d3, e2, b5, and now we have a what the frack moment. He plays bishop to b4. This is being cute. No time to be cute. But it is time to play it safe with king to c7. And how does white proceed here? If he plays king takes h4, we can play bishop takes on c5. And now king to g3, king to b6. And if knight takes bishop, we promote. So he's got to come and get that pawn with the king. And now we can play this. And he still can't take the bishop. Well, now he can. Bishop to e7. But he has no way to protect that a-pawn. Because after knight to b2, bishop f6 hits the knight. Knight c4 check. King comes up. And now I think the best that white can do here is liquidate and try and win with the knight pawn. But I think after king to b5, the black king is close enough that he's going to be able to draw this. And here, instead of king takes h4, if he tries c6, then I think bishop to e7, guarding the pawn. King to g4, a6, shattering the pawns. Pawn takes, king f3, king d6. And again, I think we have a position that black can probably draw. Amazing. He plays bishop to b4. And now, c6. Check. King to c7. All right, let's pop over one last time to board 1, see what's happening over there. Now that we know what's happening or likely to happen on board 4, players continued with king c3 by Mackenzie, rook a3 check by Sergey, king to b2, rook a4, king to b3, rook to a1. The writing's on the wall, folks. King to b2, rook to a4, king to b3, rook to a1, king to b2, rook to a4, and we have a draw. So right now, at this moment, a draw on board 1, a win for Arizona on 2, a draw on board 3, and we come to finally the 4th board to see what's happening there. It comes down to this one. If Pedram can find a way to draw, Arizona wins the match. And white is winning after king takes h4. because there's only cheapos. And now Pedram plays e1 equals queen. And I think that that's not the best move. I think the best move is to promote the pawn to a bishop with check. Let the guy freak out over it for a moment, and maybe he'll overstep the time limit. Could you imagine that? Just confusing your opponent by under promotion and winning on time. But it would be answered in the same way that this move is. He would take. Bishop takes, and it's too little too late for black here. King g4, a6, king f4, it's just all over. A b5, king b6. Problem is for black, you can't take that pawn. g4, bishop b4. g5, bishop c3. King to f5, king to c7, king to e6, bishop d2, g6, bishop c3, king to f7. Pedram resigned at this point because if he goes king to d6, it's pretty simple that he's going to lose this king and pawn ending. It's not rocket science. All right. Well, it's a victory for Philadelphia on board 4, but they lost on board 2. So they managed to save the match. And it was a gimme. Arizona gave him that one. Tough game for Pedram. Very tough game. On the one hand, it's disappointing it was a tied match. But on the other hand, Philadelphia is no pushover. So give the guys from Arizona some credit for coming up with a good game plan on how to handle them. And good game, Mark, on board too. That was a nice game. There was some tactics in there that was pretty surprising. And playing b6, it's just, man, that was just like, to me, that was a stroke of genius. All right, folks, that's it for this match. It's a tie. And next week, heck, I don't even know who they're playing next week. I'll post that in the comments. All right, until next time, good luck.